Viewer discretion advised. The content in this video may be deeply upsetting. All photographs are genuine historical images obtained through careful research and are documented by historical archives. Ukraine, winter 1933. A mother holds her dying child in a frozen village. The child's eyes are hollow, skin stretched tight over bones. "Mama," the child whispers, "please. Just some milk." But there is no milk. There is no bread. There is nothing. Outside, bodies lie in the snow, neighbors, friends, family. Dogs walk past, sniff the corpses, and turn away. Even they won't touch the dead. This isn't a natural disaster. This isn't drought or plague. This is murder by starvation. Joseph Stalin and the Soviet government engineered a famine that killed between 3.9 and 7 million Ukrainians in just 2 years. They took the grain, they exported the food, they locked the borders, and they watched millions die. The world called it the Holodomor, death by hunger, in Ukrainian. But here's the question that still haunts historians today. Was this genocide? Or was it just brutal Soviet policy that went tragically wrong? The answer will shock you, because the evidence suggests this wasn't collateral damage. It was deliberate, systematic, and targeted specifically at the Ukrainian people. To understand the Holodomor, you need to understand Ukraine's place in the Soviet Union. Ukraine, the Soviet breadbasket. Ukraine was, and still is, one of the most fertile agricultural regions on Earth. The rich black soil, known as Chernozem, made Ukraine the breadbasket of Europe. For centuries, Ukrainian farmers grew wheat, rye, and barley that fed millions. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917 and created the Soviet Union, they knew they needed Ukraine's grain to survive. But there was a problem. Ukrainian peasants didn't want to give up their land. Stalin's plan, collectivization. In 1929, Joseph Stalin announced a radical new policy, collectivization. All private farms would be abolished. All land, livestock, and equipment would be seized by the state and organized into massive collective farms called kolkhozes. The official reason? To modernize Soviet agriculture and increase production. The real reason? To crush Ukrainian independence and force peasants into total submission. Communist Party agitators descended on Ukrainian villages with lists of names and quotas. They confiscated land, homes, and livestock. They arrested anyone who resisted. They deported wealthier peasants called kulaks to labor camps in Siberia, where most died. By 1932, Ukraine's rural economy was in chaos. Production dropped. Peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over. Armed rebellions broke out across the countryside. And Stalin was furious. "We may lose Ukraine." In August 1932, Stalin wrote to his colleague Lazar Kaganovich, "If we don't make an effort now to improve the situation in Ukraine, we may lose Ukraine." Think about that phrase, lose Ukraine. Stalin wasn't worried about a famine. He was worried about losing control, and his solution wasn't to ease the pressure or provide relief. It was to tighten the noose. What happened next was systematic, calculated, and horrifying. Step 1. Seize the grain. In the fall of 1932, Soviet authorities imposed impossible grain procurement quotas on Ukrainian farms. Even though the harvest had been poor, the government demanded more grain than the previous year. Teams of Communist Party officials and secret police swept through villages, searching every home for hidden food. They used metal rods to probe walls, floors, and gardens, looking for buried grain. If they found even a handful of wheat, the entire family could be arrested and deported to Siberia. By the end of 1932, Soviet authorities had procured 4.27 million tons of grain from Ukraine, enough to feed 12 million people for an entire year. And where did that grain go? It was exported, sold abroad for cash. While Ukrainians starved, Soviet grain was shipped to Western Europe and sold on international markets. Step 2. Block all escape. In January 1933, as famine began to ravage the countryside, Stalin issued a secret directive. Ukrainian peasants were forbidden from leaving the republic. Internal passports were introduced. Travel permits were required. Border guards were stationed at train stations and roads. Anyone caught trying to flee was arrested and sent back to their village to die. One survivor recalled, "Just before they could buy tickets, the police came, lined the people up, and took everything away. They could only keep one loaf of bread each, and you couldn't say a word because they could kill you." Step 3. Blacklist entire villages. Farms and villages that failed to meet grain quotas were placed on blacklists. Blacklisted villages were cut off from all supplies. No food could be brought in. No trade was allowed. Armed guards surrounded the villages, ensuring no one escaped and no aid arrived. It was a death sentence. Step 4. Reject foreign aid. As news of the famine began to leak out, foreign governments and charities offered help. The Soviet Union rejected it all. Moscow not only refused aid, they denounced those who offered it as capitalist propagandists trying to destabilize the USSR. And all the while, people were dying at a rate of 28,000 per day. The winter and spring of 1933 were hell on earth. Starvation in slow motion. When a human body is starved, it doesn't die quickly. First, the body burns through fat reserves. Then it begins consuming muscle tissue. Organs shrink. The immune system collapses. Skin becomes translucent and bloated with fluid, a condition called edema. Survivors described walking skeletons with swollen bellies and glowing skin. Children were the first to die. Their small bodies couldn't withstand prolonged starvation. One survivor, Klavdia, recalled her sister's final words. "Klavdia, give me some milk. Mummy, please give me something to eat." But there was nothing to give. "We walked around like skeletons," Klavdia said. "Our bodies were glowing and we looked as though we had been pumped up. That is how we were." It was terrible, truly terrible. Bodies in the streets, in villages across Ukraine, corpses lay in the streets. On the streets in the villages, people, usually children, just sat there. One here, dead, one there, dead, Klavdia remembered. Dogs walked by, sniffed them, and even they didn't want to eat them. No one had the strength to bury the dead. Bodies piled up in homes, in fields, along roadsides. Desperate measures. Starving families ate anything they could find. They boiled tree bark. They made bread from grass and weeds. They ate pets, cats, dogs, rats. One survivor, Maria Tilner, recalled, "My family survived by eating waste left from sugar production. Others weren't so lucky." The unthinkable cannibalism. And then there were the cases no one wants to talk about. In November 2023, Ukraine's Interior Ministry published documentation on 1,022 criminal cases of cannibalism during the Holodomor. In 2024, that number increased to over 2,050 documented cases. Let that sink in. More than 2,000 cases where human beings, driven mad by starvation, resorted to eating the dead and sometimes the living. These weren't monsters. They were victims. As Interior Ministry State Secretary Inna Yashchuk noted, people who resorted to cannibalism are victims of the Holodomor. Soviet authorities didn't see it that way. They arrested cannibalism suspects, charged them with murder, and sent them to labor camps. Psychological examinations were almost never conducted. The horror of the Holodomor wasn't just the deaths, it was the complete destruction of human dignity. How many people died in the Holodomor? The answer depends on who you ask, and that's part of what makes this so controversial. The numbers. A 2015 study by demographers from the Ukrainian Institute of Demographic and Social Studies and the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill concluded that approximately 3.9 million Ukrainians died during the Holodomor of 1932 to 33. Other estimates range from 5 to 7 million. Harvard University's demographic research estimates total famine losses at 4.5 million, including 3.9 million direct deaths and 0.6 million indirect losses from lost births. To put that in perspective, 13% of Ukraine's total population died in just 2 years. In rural areas, the death rate was even higher. 16% of the rural population perished. Regional devastation. The famine didn't affect all of Ukraine equally. Some regions saw death rates of over 20% of the population. In the hardest-hit areas, entire villages were wiped out. Between 1926 and 1939, the Ukrainian population increased by only 6.6%, compared to 16.9% in Russia and 11.7% in Belarus. The number of ethnic Ukrainians decreased by 10%. An entire generation was erased. Here's where the controversy begins: the genocide debate. To date, 30 countries have officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. These include the United States, Canada, Australia, most of the European Union, and many others. But not everyone agrees. The question comes down to intent. Did Stalin deliberately target Ukrainians for extermination because of their ethnicity? Or was the famine a tragic consequence of brutal but non-genocidal policies? The case for genocide. In 2021, a groundbreaking study by economists Andrei Markevich, Natalia Naumenko, and Nancy Chian analyzed massive panel data and reached a stunning conclusion. Anti-Ukrainian bias in Soviet policy explains up to 92% of famine mortality in Ukraine and 77% of famine deaths in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus combined. The study found that mortality was directly correlated with the percentage of ethnic Ukrainians in a region even outside Ukraine itself. Food productivity had no correlation with death rates. Grain procurement quotas were higher in Ukrainian majority states. Grain retention, food left for local consumption, was lower in Ukrainian areas. Migration restrictions specifically targeted Ukrainians. In other words, the famine was engineered specifically to target ethnic Ukrainians. Most historians who have studied this period agree. The Holodomor was deliberate and linked to a broader Soviet policy to subjugate the Ukrainian people. The counter-argument. But not all historians accept the genocide label. Historian Mark Tauger argues that while Soviet policies were brutal and caused mass death, they weren't motivated by ethnic hatred. Tauger claims that if the Soviet government had left grain in Ukraine, other parts of the USSR would have faced even worse famine. In his view, higher collectivization rates in Ukraine reflected Soviet beliefs that Ukraine was better prepared for collectivization, not discrimination. Critics respond, so what? Even if the Soviets believed their own propaganda, the fact remains that they knowingly implemented policies that resulted in millions of deaths, specifically among Ukrainians. The smoking gun Soviet archives opened after the collapse of the USSR provide damning evidence. Documents show that Soviet authorities undertook measures specifically in Ukraine with the knowledge that the result would be the deaths of millions of Ukrainians by starvation. They knew, and they did it anyway. For decades, the Soviet Union denied the Holodomor ever happened. Stalin's lie throughout the 1,930 seconds, Soviet propaganda insisted there was no famine. Foreign journalists who reported on the famine were expelled or discredited. Western sympathizers of the Soviet Union, including some prominent intellectuals, dismissed reports of mass starvation as anti-Soviet propaganda. Even during World War II and the decades that followed, the Holodomor remained hidden. Why the silence? Why did the world ignore the Holodomor for so long? Partly, it was Soviet censorship and propaganda, but it was also political convenience. During World War II, the Soviet Union was a key ally against Nazi Germany. Western governments didn't want to acknowledge Soviet atrocities. After the war, Cold War, politics made it difficult to discuss Soviet crimes without being labeled anti-communist or pro-fascist. It wasn't until the 1,980 seconds, as the Soviet Union began to crumble, that survivors could finally speak openly about what had happened. Survivor testimonies. Organizations like the Ukrainian-Canadian Research and Documentation Center have preserved hundreds of survivor testimonies. These voices, many now gone, are the last living witnesses to one of history's greatest crimes. Their stories are heartbreaking, but they must be told. The Holodomor didn't just kill millions, it shaped the course of World War II. Demographic catastrophe. By 1939, Ukraine's population was devastated. Millions were dead. Millions more were traumatized, weakened, and scattered. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ukraine was in no position to resist. Ukrainian collaboration. Some Ukrainians, remembering the horrors of the Holodomor, initially welcomed the Nazi invaders as liberators from Soviet tyranny. This is a painful and controversial topic, but it's important to understand. The Holodomor created deep resentment against the Soviet regime, resentment the Nazis exploited. Of course, the Nazis were no liberators. They committed their own atrocities in Ukraine, including the mass murder of Jews and other undesirables. But the fact that some Ukrainians collaborated with the Nazis speaks to the depth of trauma inflicted by the Holodomor. Soviet repression continues. Even after World War II, the Soviet Union continued to suppress Ukrainian identity and memory. Discussing the Holodomor was forbidden. Memorials were banned. Survivors who spoke out were imprisoned. It wasn't until Ukrainian independence in 1991 that the full truth could finally emerge. Today, Ukraine fights to ensure the world remembers the Holodomor and recognizes it as genocide. 30 countries and counting. As of 2024, 30 countries have officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. In November 2024, alone, Ireland, Moldova, and Romania joined the list. But many countries, including Russia, of course, refuse to recognize it. Why recognition matters? Why does it matter whether the Holodomor is called a famine or a genocide? Because words shape memory, and memory shapes the future. If the Holodomor is just a tragic famine, it becomes a footnote in history, a sad but unavoidable consequence of modernization. But if it's genocide, it's a crime. A deliberate act of mass murder, something that must never be repeated. And it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How did the world let this happen? And could it happen again? The Holodomor is not ancient history. There are still survivors alive today, though they are in their 90 and won't be with us much longer. Their stories must be preserved. Their suffering must be acknowledged, and the world must reckon with what happened. So here's the question we must ask ourselves. Was the Holodomor genocide? The evidence says yes. Stalin's government deliberately implemented policies designed to starve ethnic Ukrainians. They knew millions would die, and they did it anyway. But some historians disagree. They argue it was brutal policy, not ethnic extermination. What do you think? Was this genocide a deliberate attempt to destroy the Ukrainian people? Or was it just a catastrophic policy failure that happened to kill millions of Ukrainians? And here's the even harder question. Why did the world stay silent for so long? Why were Stalin's crimes ignored while Nazi crimes were prosecuted at Nuremberg? Is it because the Soviets were our allies? Because acknowledging Soviet atrocities was politically inconvenient? Or is it something darker, a willingness to overlook mass murder when it happens far away, to people we don't know, in a language we don't speak? Tell us in the comments. Do you believe the Holodomor was genocide? Should Stalin be remembered alongside Hitler as one of history's greatest mass murderers? And why? Do you think this tragedy remained hidden for so long? Because if we don't remember the Holodomor, if we don't learn from it, history will repeat itself. And next time, it might